Looked at Heidegger's teacher Karl Braig's critique of modernity, and at the end we were looking at his critique of the pragmatic conception of truth. So he rejects the pragmatic conception of truth, or its centrality anyway, because the pragmatic conception of truth makes truth subservient to human will or use or human. So in that sense, pragmatic conception of truth is part and parcel of modernity, because modernity makes everything into an instrument of human will or desire. So instead of pragmatic conception of truth, he presents a sort of transcendent conception of truth, what he calls historical truth, like all truth. Most brilliantly victorious is mathematical truth, the strictest form of eternal truth, because mathematical truth supposedly, at least in its mathematical truth, at least in its veracity, is not subservient to human will. But the example of mathematical truth is a bit odd, because mathematics has been an essential tool for the modernist conception of science and technology and all those things. Anyway, but on the whole, it's clear that instead of pragmatic conception of truth, he presents an eternal conception of truth, which is not subservient to the human will. So historical truth, like all truth, comes before the subjective ego. So eternal truth is not subservient to subjective ego and exists without it. So in that sense, it is an eternal truth that it cannot be changed. Mathematical truth or logical truth, but that depends on your conception of mathematics and logic. If you're with Coin, or even Wittgenstein, you will say that, mathematical truth and logical truth also can be changed. It's just that changing it will require you to change the whole form of life. But even though the examples are not good, the thrust of the critique is clear, because eternal truth comes before the subjective ego. It exists without it. It's not reliant on it and its whims. As soon as the ego or reason regards the reasonableness of things, they are not in truth. So things are beyond us, but when we subsume things under our own will, they become subjective truth. And I'm sure he's not against subjective truth, or he's not against using things, but he's against this ideology, modernism, which makes the human subjectivity the supreme principle. That's what he is. And everything else becomes secondary to that. They are not in truth. So human beings, so you can't talk about truth if you are attached to the subjectivity, or if you have your worldview is subject-centered or self-centered, because truth requires transcending that self and subsuming the self under and adjusting it according to the reality of the things, not trying to impose our own will on the things. So they are not truth, and even though they might be legitimate to use things within limits. So he's not rejecting that, but he's rejecting making self into the center of everything. And no count will change the law that commands man to act in accordance with the things. So things are transcendent. Even though we can use things, ultimately things don't obey us. They have their own eternal law. They have their own truth, which is not subservient to of will. So the basic difference, the basic fundamental wedge between modernity and non-modern worldviews, according to Braig, is that modernity is attached to the self, a conception of man where man becomes God in a sense. And it tries to impose his individual or species related will on the universe as a whole. So that's what he's critiquing. Now, in the rest of the session, I want to focus on this question. I want to raise this question. The question whether is Braig's and by extension Heidegger's critique, as far as we have seen it here, is this able to transcend modernity necessarily? Or in other words, if we tame the claims of subjectivity and push ourselves towards the realizing the transcendence of the things in nature, are we necessarily going to be able to transcend modernity? That's the question I want to ask in the rest of this session. And obviously that question is not discussed in this passage we were considering, but I'll try to talk about it just generally here. Okay. So the question we are going to raise now are very difficult questions. So the answer I'm going to give are very provisional as well. We have to be. So according to Braig's conception, the basis of modernity is the sovereignty of self. And what he's saying is this sovereignty of self is a conception which is untenable in the long run. Untenable in the long run. Because in reality, whether we take this self as individual or as species, this self is not sovereign in reality. It's not sovereign. Sovereignty of this self is an illusion. And the civilization based on this conception of sovereignty is ultimately going to disintegrate or crumble, or it must transform itself into something else. And instead of the sovereignty of self, what Braig and in a sense, at least later Heidegger as well, are proposing is the sovereignty of, or even if not the sovereignty of things. So great phenomenologist's slogan of back to things. And conceptualizing the modernist self as Dasein, or later Heidegger, being in the world, not something which is a will separate from the world, but as being which is part and parcel of this world, is a thing among other things. And the harmonious relationship with other things in the universe is the best way of living sustainable life on this earth. And as thing among things, also realizing the transcendence of transcendence of nature, of things, in the sense that our knowledge as well as our desire can never actually be able to exhaust the infinite depth of the world and the universe around us, of the objects around us. So the best way is to embrace that transcendence and live a life in this universe harmoniously. That's why people who have been impressed by these lines of thought have been talking about the death of the subject, and what they're talking about is basically the death of the modernist conception of self. Or its disintegration or its deconstruction. As Foucault says, that man has been a very recent creation, the creation of our modernity, and with passage of time it will become a passe. A wreckage of human history. And the argument is that Nietzsche said that, even though modernist conception of self is based on Christian conception of God, so once this self becomes the Lord of this universe, Christian God is dead. Christian God is dead. Christian, Jewish, Abrahamic God is dead. And this death of God is replaced by a new God, which is this self. Whether this self is individual self or species being, depending on which stream of modernity you are talking about. But people like Foucault, who were impressed by both Nietzsche and Heidegger, they said that this self was fashioned after the Christian conception of God and God's will and God's self. And the death of Christian God, untenability of its conception, eventually mean that we are looking at the death of self as well, death of man as well, because this man was fashioned after this God. So if the God is dead, then man is dead as well. And according to Craig and people like Braig and Heidegger, what we are left with are things. Should become part and parcel of this universe. So it's a sort of pagan conception. So are they talking about sovereignty of things, sovereignty of nature, or some other relationship with things, of being in the world? And what this relationship would be, obviously conceptually it is drastically, at least conceptually, it's totally different from the concept where the self is the Lord. But if we fashion the conception of self after its disintegration, Uh, are we abandoning modernity and entering into new civilization, or we are just merely revising modernity into more tamed versions of modernity, which some people have called post-modernity. A modernity which is post-modernity can be seen as a modernity which is not very confident. So it receives from some of its bombastic claims, but it doesn't really change things in any fundamental ways, because three elements of this modernist conception: science, technology, and capitalism, are as strong as they were, or even if not more. So these philosophical, critiques of modernity haven't touched the actual concrete reality of modernity, which actually is not necessarily the sovereignty of self, but what the system which was built in order to establish the sovereignty of self. So even if you abandon the bombastic claims about the nature of that self, the science, technology, and capitalism, institutions which were established to actually actualize the sovereignty of that self, is still well and running. And neither postmodernists nor Heideggerians, despite their critique of science and technology and capitalism, have come up with anything other than going back to some pagan primitive lifestyle, which is another utopia, which is totally impractical, at least at the civilizational level today. So what I'm saying is, that even if you move from self to thing, in actuality, modernity is still there. We are not seeing the dawn of a new civilization or new idea, because three institutions which modernity had established, science, technology, and capitalism, are there. And none of the critics of modernity, whether they are Nietzscheans or Heideggerian or Foucauldian or Braigians, have any idea or even any desire of replacing these. So in that sense, we can say that these critiques are negative critiques, in the sense that they are powerful critiques of certain conceptions of modernity, but they don't really come up with a new civilizational idea. They will eventually lead to some taming of modernity. Like, instead of growth, you come up with sustainable growth, and instead of reckless capitalism, you come up with environmentally friendly capitalism. And those people who are really against the notion of science, technology, and capitalism, they are mostly primitivists who might be able to live personally in a different way, but as far as the civilizational level is concerned, they haven't come up with an idea which can become, or which can become harbinger of a new civilization. It doesn't seem to me, at least. So in that sense, we are stuck with modernity for now, anyway. And there are, I think, theoretical reasons for that, but I don't want to go into those theoretical reasons here, because firstly, I have only vague ideas about those things, and secondly, it will require many more sessions, and we will in the future come to those questions in different contexts. So we'll stop here. So this basically ends these sessions on Braig and Heidegger.